So there's this whole thing of sex positivity, and it's definitely a big part, I think, of the sexual revolution that started in the 50s, 60s, that is about body freedom, self-liberation, expressive individualism, do what you want, free love, all that kind of jazz.
Therapeutic views of the world and the human person. Like the goal of life is to feel comfortable, feel happy, things like that. So,
and I've been reflecting on how often, especially in evangelical Protestant subcultures, that even when we're kind of anti big picture sex positivity of like, oh yeah, go do whatever you want with your body, that our view of marriage is still heavily influenced by this really very positive view of sex. Like, sex is great. It's the best. Like, if you want a satisfactory life, you need sex. Welcome to Communion and Shalom.
in this podcast, we are exploring how the biblical and historic Christian faith can engage sexuality, ethnicity, culture, and our local communities as we pursue the flourishing of God's kingdom. Our goal is to engage these topics charitably and with nuance.
My hearty recommendation to join us at the Revoice conference starting today, Wednesday, June 26th. If you aren't already there and want to be, you can still join online. Even though the conversation on faith and sexuality has always been personal to me, Revoice has helped my conversations be more rooted in the soil of God's Word and be more abundant with the fruits of the Spirit, especially joy and goodness. Whether you are side B, questioning, an ally, I think it will be worth it for you. You can find a link to the Revoice website and a 5% discount code for a virtual access ticket in the show notes. Hello, and welcome to a fun episode of Communion and Shalom. This is David Frank.
Hi everyone, this is TJ.
There is a piece that was just released as well that should be available both in written form, or you can listen to the reading of it, that I wrote. That's this reflection, prayerful reflection in the kind of in the mode or form that St. Augustine wrote his Confessions. I'm thinking about things biblically, theologically, but in a prayerful spirit, a little bit of fear and trembling of just like recognizing that knowledge is to some degree out of grasp to us, but knowable, but not fully comprehensible. Yeah. So give that a listen or a read, maybe before jumping into this, because part of what we're talking about today is reflecting on that, and overall, what we'll be digging into and what that piece is on is this question: is the Bible sex positive? And so at some level, we need to start with, okay, what is sex positivity?
Yes.
So, and I tried to do a little bit of research. Okay, how are people talking about this? When I first was thinking about sex positivity, and that because I hear people talk about it, it's sometimes used in parallel with body positivity, and I took these mostly just at face value of like, oh, it's people wanting to be positive, not negative, not shaming or condemning about their bodies or about sex. And I'm like, well, that seems good. God made bodies. God made sex. So I should be on board with that. But it seemed to carry with it a ethos of, everything goes. Like, we could never say no to anything we do with our bodies, any way to think about our bodies, anything we do with sex. And so I went and listened to a podcast that gave a little description of sex positivity, where they said, in sex positivity, sex is about responsibility and joy, pleasure and trust. And then a little more research, it's kind of considered, a whole philosophical movement that promotes the idea that all forms of consensual sexual expression are fundamentally healthy and normal. The one summary was anything goes except for children, dead people, and animals, because there's
okay.
no consent there. That was their no-nos. And
Some of those are debated though,
oh,
like
I'm
among
sure they are.
some sex positive people.
Because you have to be like, how do you define consent? What does that really mean? For this one mommy blogger, that she was quoting, that's
how she
put the limits of sex positivity.
And I assume that's the more dominant view among sex positive people, what that woman is describing.
Yeah, I think so. And
can I add one thing?
Yeah,
before you continue?
Go ahead.
I assume we also have to say sex positivity does see itself as a moral project which displaces prior more Christian ethical assumptions around sex.
Mm-hmm.
Like it sees itself as a disruptive, displacing project.
Yeah, when was that first term, sex positivity?
From my very brief look into this before we started recording, from the Oxford English Dictionary, they recorded that the first example of sex positive as a phrase is from 1953.
Okay.
And the definition Oxford English Dictionary has, which is similar to yours, sex positive means that something that has or promotes a tolerant, progressive, or candid attitude towards sex and sexuality, or pro-sex. Now, but the whole definition, these are listing types of virtues: tolerant, candid, progressive. But then the whole question comes, what do those mean? In the same way, what you're talking about, like responsible, and what are the other virtues they list? Responsible, like joyful, those are virtues, but the question is, what do they mean actually when you put them into practice in a life, a human life?
So, I think what sex positivity is rejecting, they might just call sex negativity.
Yeah.
That sex negativity is any of those attitudes or beliefs or cultural norms that looks down on, any quote unquote taboo behaviors.
Yeah.
And it just, aside from their ones that don't meet the consensual test, that they're just like, it is wrong to call those immoral or just to say that they're harmful if they're not potentially able to be done in a safe way. And it's interesting. TJ, because in some ways I relate to that.
Sure.
That of like, I just remember seeing someone's last name, and a baseball player's last name when I was young. His last name was like Sexton, and I was like, sex, like taboo,
Sure.
sex, and I think maybe a lot of American evangelical, I don't know how much we're just influenced by Northern European kind of like hush hush, like sex is
one thing I noticed
taboo we talked about.
This is similar to what you're describing. When I was young and I was in U.S. Evangelical church, the main sins we talked about were sexual sins. As a young child, that's what I processed, what we were like not supposed to do. They were sexual sins. We didn't really talk about economic sins. We didn't really talk about doctrinal sins. We didn't really talk about like sins among like not being a peacemaker, right? We didn't talk about justice sins. We talked about sexual sins. So I kind of think you're right. There, at least maybe our generation, I think a lot of us processed that sex was bad, and that was like a chief sin among the like many ways of being not in accord with God's, like moving with the Spirit maybe, or walking with the Spirit, not in accord with God. So yeah, I believe you.
Yeah, and it's like, so some people would say that Christianity has been a major proponent in sex negativity, which leads to condemning homosexuals, leads to condemning anybody who falls outside of the
polyamory, kinks, certain types of fetishes are negative, but certain types of fetishes, pornography, even like just having this idea of having a youthful sexual, like, what can I say? Escapade, or like youthful sexual,
just adventure, experience, discovery.
Yeah, all those things.
Yeah, which was really fascinating. Tuning in briefly to this podcast that's about kind of a sex positive perspective on parenting and encouraging children, like, oh no, don't, like, pornography is actually pretty destructive, but here's all these novels with all these sex scenes to help your kids develop a sexual imagination. And it was just like Whoa.
But I've also heard sex positive people talk about ethical pornography, right? They try to pursue certain types of pornography that they see as not like making the workers' lives bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think pornography has a lot of
Mm-hmm.
injustice just beyond its corruption generally. So yeah,
And
I don't know.
so there's this whole thing of sex positivity, and it's definitely a big part, I think, of the sexual revolution that started in the 50s, 60s. That is about body freedom, self-liberation, expressive individualism, do what you want, free love, all that kind of jazz.
Therapeutic views of the world and the human person.
Hmm.
Like the goal of life is to feel comfortable, feel happy,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. So,
As I've been thinking about, in this kind of side B conversation space of really like, okay, God, you give us these limits that I trust. Why are they there? What how have you designed sex to be? What do you intend for it? What do you want it to mean? And I've been reflecting on how often, especially in maybe evangelical Protestant subcultures, that we even when we're kind of like anti, big picture sex positivity of like, oh yeah, go do whatever you want with your body, that
hmm
our view of marriage is still heavily influenced by this really like very,
yeah,
very positive view of sex. Like sex is great. It's the best. Like if you want a
hmm
satisfactory life, you need sex.
yeah,
Um, and we try to reject maybe, you know, sex positivity, the philosophical movement, while still holding on to this kind of idolization of sex or sexual pleasure.
hmm
And it feels like it's at some level maybe I don't know if it's a double standard, but it cuts back, it undermines our ability, I think, to hold a traditional sexual ethic of
hmm
encouraging sex within monogamous covenantal heterosexual marriages
hmm
when we make it all when I think sex has actually been distorted in ways that our heterosexual traditional conservative churches are unaware of. Am I making
hmm
sense, DJ?
Totally. One thing I also wanted to mention, and I had a professor who talked about this, and there's literature on this. A lot of times in the past, when we were younger, in these in these times in different evangelical circles, even outside of the U.S., there was this idea: say like be abstinent until marriage, because once you have marriage, you'll have mind-blowingly great sex,
Mm-hmm.
and that's part of this kind of thread or this phenomena that you're following, and that means like if you get married, you don't have mind-blowing phenomenal sex, then you're like, what happened? Or if you never get married, does that mean that
Mm-hmm.
you can't obtain this amazing good that everyone else is working for or desiring?
Mm-hmm.
And that's still part of this. Both of those things are part of this movement that you're just, again, this thread or this idea that you're describing. Because again, it's like sex is a pinnacle, the pinnacle, at least a pinnacle of human life. And we all need that. And this is not to say that most human beings desire sex. I think that's true. But that doesn't mean that it's a different thing to say people desire it versus this is like the pinnacle of a good life. It's something different. It's a different claim. So,
Mm-hmm. And
yeah.
and there's plenty of podcasts and readings I'm sure you can go do on purity culture, which have this kind of
hmm
idolization of sex. But I want to think about it, kind of this question of, well, I think it's pretty clear that the Bible does not support a free love, sex positivity, anything goes type of vibe. But in this piece, I wanted to still reflect on, well, how does God want us to think about sex? There might be some Christian thinkers throughout time who you could describe as unhelpfully sex negative, who are
Sure.
overly suspicious and down on it. And in addition to these kind of purity movements like save sex for the best sex for marriage, I think even Josh Butler's recent work suffers from some of this over. The imagination around sex being really tied up with pleasure-giving aspects of sex, especially maybe on the male side.
Can you introduce Josh Butler a bit of when you're done?
Yeah, I think I might actually be meeting him this summer. So, Josh, if you listen to this,
Okay.
I look forward to meeting you. And I hold you in warm affection. And I know you've gotten lots of blowback on your book. I think you've appreciated what you've learned in the process. Do you remember the name of his book now?
Called The Beautiful Union.
Yeah, he wrote a book that was just really looking at how does the sexual intercourse itself kind of full of theological symbolism. And some of the ways that he went to the biblical passages to do that analysis, I think misread some of them, and so it focused on certain parts of sexual intercourse that, and trying to draw like theological meaning out of it, specifically like penetration. I'm sure there's really great chapters on the actual like covenant of marriage, beautiful union, and that there's a lot of, I'm sure, good strengths to the book. Anyways, but I think there's parts of that book that are even a fruit of, I bring it up only to say, I think some of the way that our imaginations have been pushed is like we're just like becoming more and more erotic in our imagination. We're like, sex is so good. I just like, let's get into all the like sensual details of it. And
can we just say more sensual?
Huh?
Erotic. You said we're getting more erotic. Can we say more sensual?
Yes, more sensual. So that we'll maybe hit on this later of just like, what does erotic mean? And what are the different ways we do use it or should use it? In my piece, I probably use it in a few different ways, and TJ will bicker about that. So in response to our culture's propositions around sex positivity, in this episode we are going to go through 5 key points in the scripture where that we're going to use in our reflection. There might be some other pieces that talk about sex, but we're going to look on 5 main ones that I think give us an alternative to sex positivity and an alternative to sex negativity, and kind of guide us through this mystery. So that'll be in Genesis, in Songs of Songs, in Leviticus, in the Gospel of Matthew, and in Revelation. Let's go.
Let's go.
So, first thing, I kind of wrestle in with my piece is, okay, so like, yes, we know that God made our bodies are good, but in the garden we have, why does that shame, that first acknowledgement of nakedness go to cover up the genitals? You know, there's some mystery here around the sexual differentiation between Adam and Eve, and they're like, oh, we're naked and we're different and we're embarrassed, and there's this shame brought on in nakedness. And some people try to address that, I think, by this sex positivity. We need to undo that shame of the garden. I don't think that cuts it. I want to know what Jesus is doing here with our bodies and with sex. And so I reflect on, okay, like, you give the command, be fruitful and multiply. You know, like, you clearly have designed the male and female genitalia, bodies to come together, to be fruitful, to have a beautiful union, and for that to be part of your plan for this world. So that shouldn't be something we're negative about. Even quickly, what we call consent and the limits of consent, that's like the main part of sex positivity. It has biblical backing, of course, from an overall perspective of just human dignity and how we think about that. But specifically in 1 Corinthians 7:3, it talks about the conjugal rights or the marital duties of a husband and wife to each other. And it describes it in both a way that's very mutual, and it's an active, the verb is like an active giving. The husband and wife must, of their own volition, fulfill their obligation to one another. It is not something that you force or take from your spouse, but it is something that you give to them. So this consent is baked into the 1 Corinthians language. And this other big part around sex positivity that I think is also lines up with the scripture as well. It's like God has created us, James 1:17, every good and perfect gift comes from the Father of lights. And so we must learn to accept these things. And so I think there's general principles of stewardship here. And then the Songs of Solomon, like it doesn't, it kind of is like it's a whole book of the Bible around a love story. Maybe we can call it an erotic story, love poetry. I don't know, TJ, do you have any ways that you've best heard it described?
I like the term erotic, but I also know the Song of Solomon has many readings. It says readings which were often shifted towards erotic of the spiritual, like more as a movement or a piece of literature for being the eros towards God rather than the eros towards two lovers. But I'm just saying it could have multiple levels
Yeah.
of meaning, not just one.
And what I have found really interesting, specifically in my class with Dr. Alistair Roberts, he used the term anti-pornographic imagery. That the way that there is this very sensual parts of Songs of Songs or Songs of Solomon, but the way that it's reflecting on her cheeks, and then it makes you think about the rams running down the hills or something like that, and it's constantly drawing back to creation. And I don't think that's because like people looked at rams running down a hill and were like, oh, that's really sexy, but it's this larger imagination or picture or an embrace of beauty, and that the looking at the beauty of the beloved is drawing one out to see the beauty of all creation.
I think that's from Solomon 4:1. It says, "How beautiful are you, my darling? Oh, how beautiful! Your eyes behind your veils are doves. Your hair is like a flock of goats descending from the hills of Gilead."
Yeah, there we go. And I think that makes it ripe for the type of like allegorization that you were talking about, TJ, because is this not the way that God looks at us, his chosen ones, as Jesus looks at his bride? And as we are saved, all of creation is then embraced and saved with us. That all of creation is groaning out for the sons of redemption. And there's a way that, as the priests and kings of creation, redemption is spread through us. And so it makes sense that there's actually a very intimate connection between the beauty of creation and the beauty of the beloved. And in this way, it's just Songs of Songs isn't pornographic. It's not getting into the dirty details, but it's reflecting upon the beauty of the body, but then constantly reflecting on the beauty of Jerusalem and its city and its towers and walls, and it's looking at the beauty of the hills and the gardens and the flowers. So it's poems, it's love, it's affection, it's flirtation, it's alluring, but it's not the way that the world thinks of the erotic. It's more like the way that TJ wants to talk about eros as this larger concept. TJ, how would you define eros? What is your theological definition of that type of love?
Yeah, okay. I will define it and then have something to say afterwards. But eros is this love of one who desires to possess what that person, he or she, lacks, and and a yearning for the union with the beloved person, or the beloved thing, I guess. And the hard part is a lot of this discourse has been shaped by, at least in the U.S. C.S. Lewis's book, The Four Loves, and he defines eros in similar terms. And of course, Christian thinkers have talked about this before him and after him. But there's this way that eros became too closely associated with sexual love. And even in the contemporary English adjective that American English speakers use, erotic, which is usually used for like sexually provocative things, it focuses on one type of eros, but not eros as a larger concept of this desire for union with a beloved or the love of something that someone lacks. Of course, sex is part of that, but the Christian tradition, from my reading, is usually thinking eros is wider, because eros is ultimately what humans trying to have communion with God, or that's like the ultimate eros. So yeah, there's just more to the story than just the way that it's often used now to mean like sexual love.
And so in that way, Songs of Songs is definitely erotic in this big way. It's this picture of the
Yes.
beloved seeking, that both of them longing for each other, desiring to be with one another, to have one another.
And then it becomes allegorized towards the human person desiring and yearning for a union with God.
Yeah.
Like that's a common allegorization. So,
and
yeah.
and I think that, well, also I think that reading of Songs of Songs, of using that jump off point of a man and woman falling in love with each other, into humanity's longing for God and even God's pursuit of humanity, makes more sense the further we go into the scriptures. So, last word on Songs of Songs, erotic in this more theological sense, but not as erotic as one might think, or as it definitely could be in the colloquial modern day usage of erotic. Like it's not as
Pornographic.
It's not pornographic.
Yes.
So we've hit on kind of, beginning of Genesis. Now we're talking about Songs of Songs, and I'm going to look at a note in Leviticus, and then in Jesus's words, and then in Revelation. So these are kind of some of our touch points that we're saying, God, what are you doing with sex? How do we think about it? So I find something really interesting. So sex in old times, throughout most of history, it's not just, there's what we're most familiar with is sexual desire of just, people get horny, they want to have sex, they want connection, they want the good feelings of euphoria, of orgasm. But there's also this big part, TJ, maybe you might have better words for this, that like sex is connected with the power of the community and the society. Like if you don't reproduce, you will die. And so for
That's
you as a leader, if you want your name, your legacy, your power to continue on into the future for generations and generations and to even expand, you need sex. You need reproduction. You need children, and a large set of children.
Yeah. One of my African relatives, when I told him about possibly being celibate, his first response was, no, because your life force will end. That was literally what he told me first, because I wouldn't have children as a celibate person. So yeah, you're right. Sex has sex and marriage, I guess, at least like in a social science perspective, it has the basic function of physical and social reproduction. Like human societies need them just to continue. If sex and like marriage institutions to protect sex don't exist, then humans don't produce, and then they don't have they don't raise their children well for the community to have a good life together. So yeah, everything you said was, I think, right on. That's part of the dynamics of sex and what sex is for.
And I think that's why when we look at a lot of what we call pagan communities throughout history, sex is a common part of their religious worship, their ceremonies. There are, fertility goddesses and such. And I think because we're so sex positive and just oriented towards its pleasure as individuals, we tend to think of them more as Epicureans or something, people who are, or hedonists. That's the word I'm looking for. We tend to think of them as hedonists. They just cared about pleasure. They're just like really these horny cultures that love sexual pleasure. And that could have for sure been part of it, but I think we're missing something if we don't recognize this social reproduction. That's an interesting, like, how do you continue your life force? How do you make sure your life force does not die? And
there's
go ahead.
Something that related to that, I don't remember the exact quote, but there's a famous quote by a historian named Peter Brown, who wrote this famous biography of St. Augustine. And he writes about how sex, I wish I had the quote offhand, but he read this quote on how human sex, it ties to the very rhythm of the creation, essentially. Like there's something true about that, even though there's this complex situation on those pagan communities you mentioned who have sex orgies as part of their, you might say, religious practices. The question is, to what extent is sex transcendent, right? Or what, like, is sex a transcendent good or not?
And I think that
it's complicated.
Yeah. So there's a way that
Yeah.
Sex in its natural form allows you to transcend your life force, to transcend your own life. So reproduction itself has a transcendent reality to it. It is a propagation beyond you, transcending you. And the sexual experience, at least my understanding is a lot of animals don't necessarily experiencing it this way, but that for humans, it has a high level of dopamines. It's a kind of one of the most built-in ways that humans can experience a transcendent, seem like almost spiritual elevation through having sexual intercourse. And I think both of those are tying together, that are pulling humans into saying it, where it can feel so natural for like, oh, if worship is about connecting us with the divine, about the transcendent, then sex is like a great mechanism to have part of that, to have the divine bless it, and for us to rise up and to have that transcendent experience and connect with the divine. And I think we actually see a lot of return to this in neo-paganism, Wiccanism, and even some Christianity that starts to grab some, kind of syncretize with some of those, where it's like, oh, of course, like sex should be part of our worship of God, or our love of ourselves and our way of getting beyond ourselves. And they're engaging with this built-in thing, which God put there. So we know it's good. But what I find most interesting is not only, so in Leviticus, we know it has like lots of different rules. And of course, there's the rules in Leviticus 18 and 20 that are like, don't sleep with men as you would with women. Don't sleep with your mom. Don't sleep with your daughter. Like these different relationships that protect the integrity of the family, which I think are very much bound up in how we think about sex and family and stuff. But Leviticus 15:18 says, if a man lies with a woman and has an emission of semen, both of them shall bathe themselves in water and be unclean until the evening. So the God who created sex and genitals and the emission of semen also said, but wait, as you partake in this nearly transcendent good, you'll be unclean. You're ritually impure for a while, and you need to step back. I don't think that was merely because semen can get a little gross and God's like, ew, gross. But we have to think about, what does unclean do in Jewish society, in Israel? Being clean was part of these layers of kind of building the both moral imagination around holiness and who God is and how special it is to get close. So at this very basic level, if you were unclean, you could not enter into the temple, into worship. You could not get close to God at the most center place of the temple if you were unclean.
At this point, the Ark of the Covenant, though, right?
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant. Yeah. I mean, first it's in there, the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle, which would eventually be in a temple. So, right now they just have the tabernacle, the moving temple in a sense. But God's presence in the Ark of the Covenant there. And so it's interesting. God is, just by this one small verse of saying, if you have sex, you can't come close to the tabernacle. You can't come close to the Holy of Holies, is saying sex will never be part of worship. You see all these pagan communities around you who are worshiping fertility, who are having potentially religious orgies together. That will never happen. Nothing like that will ever happen. And I think this even overlaps a little bit with circumcision, honestly, and in the way that circumcision, God's saying, you're my people, but I'm going to cut off the foreskin. I was like, what's the word? That there's this kind of imagery of, like, I've given you this promise, Abraham, to multiply you, to prolong, he doesn't say life force, of course, but make many generations out of you, to bless the entire world through you. but it's not going to be by your power. It's not going to be by your fertility, by your reproductive power. And circumcision kind of has this like pushback against man's natural desire to assert his own power, to prolong himself, to expand his power. And this verse in Leviticus seems to just put this like, okay, you wanted to reach holiness or transcendence with sex? Nope, it's not going to be that way for God's people. Sex will not be part of worship. It's going to stay mediocre, like it, and which is potentially my counter to sex positivity is sex mediocrity. So, TJ, before I move on from Leviticus, do you have any comments on that?
I think it'd be good to talk a little bit more about this transcendent thing. And I took a class and I studied theological ethics when I was an undergraduate, right? I took a class on the topic. And one key thing when we talked about sex that my professor said was that he said Christians do not say sex is transcendent. That's like a thing of pagans was the term he used. But you're right. So it feels transcendent to many people. But the question is, how do we like make that square or put those two things together or whatever the term is? And we haven't quite, I don't think we've quite yet made that connection, how to think about that. Mm-mm. You started making it, but I don't think you quite rounded the corner to come to the conclusion.
I see a precedent where God is saying sex is not transcendent.
Yes.
Right at the beginning when he's forming his people. And that actually comes before Songs of Solomon, Songs of Songs. And which itself is elevating not per se sex, but is elevating this beautiful union, the seeking the beloved, the eros, right? In the richer
eros
sense.
General, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And at the same time, as we mentioned, we recognize the fact that human beings, the creatures we are, sex is part of how, in this age, we continue the lineages of people who God made and loves to have communion with him also. And sex is also, it's a source of, obviously, children, a source of pleasure, a source of producing kinship, a source of prestige. People use it for prestigious ends, a source of commitment, something that covenants sometimes protect. Like, it's very multifaceted. So it seems it's an important part of human life, but it's not transcendent. But the people feel like it's transcendent. So again, I'm trying to bring all these points out to show that there's a complicated constellation of things of how we configure, how we reflect on sex. And a huge problem, I think in our opinion, the larger Christian tradition is when it becomes this, like, you just fall into it thinking that it's essentially transcendent. Or it's a necessary, like, good the human's life, all humans must partake in.
And that totally fuels so many Christians' shift to side A is, wow, it would be so cruel to deprive people of sex if they feel like they can never have heterosexual sex. That would be so mean. I don't want anyone ever keeping sex from me because it's the most transcendent opportunity.
Yeah.
So it's really critical.
I agree with you there, but I think that's complex. There's a lot of complexities in what you just said, too.
Yeah. I mean, there's more to that. We talked about it go back to episode 1 to talk more about there's more to that about people's finding flourishing than just sex. But I think it does underlie it.
I don't think people should be side A, obviously, but I don't necessarily want political orders to, like, start persecuting people who do have same-sex sex also. And this is a whole nother episode, of course. But yeah, you're right. So
and I wonder, thinking about this kind of order, I was almost kind of frustrated that Songs of Songs felt so, sexy and didn't talk about children or reproduction or even explicitly about, like, marital faithfulness. I mean, it talks about love is as strong as death. Like, once you're in my grips of love, you're never getting out. And all these warnings of, like, don't kindle love till it's ready. I forget the phrasing. And which kind of sets it up for, like, Eros is bigger than sex. It's still using Songs of Songs is still embedded, of course, in a presumably sexual relationship between a man and woman, and they're engaging bodily and delighting in each other. But the fact that it's actually disentangled from the typical, are you moving from this family to another, or what are the expectations of children? But it's just so zoomed into their delight and enrapturement in each other is kind of a signpost to, I think, the vision and revelation.
I tend to think of Song of Solomon's, and I think you would agree, it's really limited in scope. It's not like these topics aren't talked about other places in the biblical narrative. And it has one angle on things, but it's not the whole story. And that's how I think about it.
And I listened to a church that's self-proclaimedly progressive, had a sermon on, erotic poetry and Songs of Songs. And they try to make the silence of Songs and Songs, specifically talking about marriage, they try to speak that silence, make it really loud, of like, like it doesn't talk about marriage, so it must mean you can just dive into eros and sex, like, free love, basically.
The whole Bible is a symphony, and Song of Solomon's is one instrument in that symphony. Yeah, and it's not the whole. It's not
a systematic theology of either eros or sex.
No, and it's not. Its notes are not the only notes that the Bible produces. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I would be skeptical of that hermeneutic that Tripp is applying.
And so go to Songs of Songs for imaginative development, not for a systematic theology.
But it could be part of a larger systematic. It's part of the biblical. It's part of biblical theology.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the whole you need. Yeah. And theology must incorporate the whole symphony of Scripture. You said it.
I think we should say the highest form of human discourse or speech is poetry, and maybe poetry done in song. And I say that because poetry both contains truth, like truth claims, maybe, or truth propositions, but it also contains a musicality that evokes the angels singing for God. And then it evokes like mystery, because it has things that its words they elide things that we can't quite touch with our words because they're too big for us, or they're something we can't know. And poetry brings all that together. And that's a different way of doing theological discourse, theological reflection, than like Protestants' insistence on propositional truth claims. And if you focus on propositional truth claims too much towards they kind of do violence to reality if you just focus on them exclusively, or if you can't recognize that the world is best described through poetry. Doesn't mean propositional truth claims aren't true, but they're maybe just a lower type of human discourse describing the true, the good, and the beautiful than poetry or poetry done in song. Like the angels worship God through song, and I think that we might say that's close to poetry. Is that right? Poetry can be sung or it's done through song. I would say that is the true soul of theology is closer to that. If you're going to talk about theological discourse than these truth claims.
I think it hits well. What you said, it hits well on that. There's a humility that's necessary when approaching God, and even when approaching the truths about our world and our bodies. That to touch on it in song allows us to know without having a comprehensive grip on it. So
we have a grip, but it's not this totalizing, universalizing grip.
Holds it. Yeah, it's a loose hold that offers it up in like humble praise and gratitude to God.
Also, as you're alluding to, it's joyful. Like song and poetry can evoke joy. They can evoke emotions, and that's part of the human experience, the human condition, the human life. Beyond just getting dry propositional truth claims, right? Like all parts of the human person can be offered up to God in praise through poetry and music, poetry done by song, in a way that truth claims don't do. Again, they have their value, but they don't do that. So as we were talking about a little bit earlier, it can do violence to the text if you, like to Song of Songs, if you do too much of a systematizing propositional truth claim oriented version towards what's happening there. Same for Psalms. You can do it. It's okay to do some systematizing, but too much can be bad. But there's integrity in the very way that they actually are, as these poetic movements that can be sung, right? So yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
We talked about these kind of Old Testament signposts: creation, Leviticus, Songs of Songs. There's more, of course, but these are just some notable ones. And then Jesus's words are I think the first really big game changer. And the Sadducees thinks the resurrection is ridiculous. So they're asking this question about, oh, Jesus, what if this person has 8 different husbands? What that's going to be in the resurrection? And he's just scoff. What are you guys even thinking? People aren't going to have marriage in the resurrection. Or marriage is more or less till death do us part. And so the marriages that you experience now are not going to continue in the new heavens and new earth, are not going to continue in the life after the resurrection. And there's more to...
They're a thing of this age. They're like a thing of this age.
Yeah. So we have
not the next age.
And I had an old roommate who had, I think, wrestling very appropriately with this question. The Bible seems to have this narrative of continuity from this age to the next. It's a story of redemption, not garbage disposal, and then God's going to start over, Earth 2.0 from scratch. No, it's renewing, it's developing, it's healing, it's cleansing, purifying. So why is there no marriage and sex in the resurrection? And Jesus most explicitly says there's not marriage in the age to come. And in short, if you're wondering, well, does that mean it's just no marriage, but we're just going to have free love and free sex, as some Christians have tried to argue and have usually created sex rings and abusive or
sex cults.
Yeah, bad stuff. It never goes down well for those people, and I don't think it's just because we're too naive of a culture to catch up with these people who've transcended our moral norms. I think it ends up being very unloving. Usually it's some older theologian man who gets younger women to sleep with him because he's well, in heaven there is no marriage, so we can just have that now. So one, look at the fruits of people who've believed that theology and see what happens. And two, where I look and see that if you understand historically and in the biblical, I think both in the biblical narrative and especially in Jesus' time, how connected sex and marriage were. And I think even that Corinthians verse we mentioned, that people could not think about marriage without thinking about sex, without thinking about reproduction. They were all tied together. You wouldn't marry someone in Jesus' time if you didn't want to have children with them. That's a whole nother episode.
We're viewing this in our times. People think through a contraceptive mentality, where they're used to contraceptive methods, which are common, accessible, and have pretty high rates of success, right? But in those times, in the past, in a lot of human communities, that wasn't the case. So as you're saying, all these things were connected. Mm-hmm. They didn't have this other mentality that we have in contemporary times because of certain technology, sexual evolution and technology. So
So there's for Jesus, that's kind of part and parcel. Saying there's no marriage would also be implying in all the hearers' ears that there's no sex. And I think this is redoubled in the fact that he says we will be like the angels. Angels do not reproduce. In the Old Testament, when there's fallen angels who do some type of reproduction stuff, it's a big no-no. It's actually also Sodom and Gomorrah is when the people of Sodom try to sleep with the visiting angels. It's a big no-no there. It's actually more about, I think, trespassing that natural boundary between sleeping, sex of the earth, sleeping with the divine, more so than it is about gender. And so we have this, oh, in the heaven we are going to be like the angels, messengers of God, solely focused on his will, not reproducing, not marrying one another. And that's like, it's like, okay, everything, like we expect for there to be trees and flowers and bodies and songs and dancing and probably math, like all these things will continue into the new heavens and new earth and be increased and beautified and more what they should. But somehow our bodies, which are made sexual, male and female, good, that will continue. But this part, we are in the kind of seed form right now, but our resurrection, fully flourishing, sprouting form is such where sex not part of the picture anymore. And it is, as far as I can think, one of the most stark discontinuities, outside of course the biggest, which is no sin. But it's hard for us, it's outside
And
of
no
the
death,
difference between like light and darkness. This is the only like creational good that we have a clear indication that will not continue. And so I think that one does make it very understandable why people would fuel that into sex negativity, because everything else that doesn't continue is evil. And so we're left with this big kind of mystery of why does this good thing not continue? And I think what John sees in the apocalyptic vision of what we call the book of Revelation, revealing the spiritual reality beyond and even the culmination of this new heavens and new earth, comes together with the picture of a wedding feast. In this future age, we are not given in marriage to one another, maybe because we are given in marriage to our King, where we together, the bride, are so brought into union and love in the joy and peace beyond imagination and understanding, will be so satisfied there. And so there is a continuity, in a sense. Our marriage and sex now finds its fulfillment and flourishing in that reality.
Could we say that our sexual energy, or maybe sexual energy, is transfigured into something new? And that also, if that is the case, that fits into what side B sometimes talks about, transfiguration of sexual desire, energy towards new ends. And that's why people in the past would call them monastics, like the angels, as if they're already partaking in they're harbingers of the future eschaton, because they're transfiguring their sexual desires towards different ends than sex, or sexual energy maybe, but something like that. But there's some continuity in what you're saying in the process of like psycho-spiritual bio transfiguration that side B talks about, and Christians in the past have talked about, past and present. So yeah, I agree.
So in summary, I don't think the Bible's talking about sex positivity, and I don't think it's sex negativity. Maybe sex mediocrity, maybe I in some way moderation is fine, but I don't feel like it just, saying like sex moderation just feels like, oh, like have some but just not too much, like don't get too into it.
What about, I mean, this is similar, holy moderation, but that's like the ethical claim. It's like, it's kind of, we have Christianity has sort of moderate claim, right? It's not sexual positive, it's not sex negative, it's somewhere in between, if we're going to use those categories. But it does say sex is, I think this is true, sex is mediocre compared to Eros's full flowering or something. Like it does say that. Sex is only part of Eros. Eros is more than that anyways. But sex is not its full flourishing is not that. It's not sex.
In a similar way that in Psalm 119, it says, like, your word, your statutes are sweeter than honey. That it's like, is honey sweet? Yes. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But its goodness is kind of moderated or mediocre in comparison to the sweetness of knowing the ways of God, the sweetness of tasting and seeing his word, his truth, his justice, his peace worked out for the flourishing of our neighborhoods, our lives, our communities. Oh, that is so much sweeter than, and I love honey a lot, but it is sweeter than honey. And yeah, I think another piece to this, is what I would assume is a lack of reproduction in the New Age. The resurrection of all of God's people into God's kingdom will be an accomplishment of God's vision of what he wanted to see the earth filled with his image bearers, kings and queens of creation, working out shalom, and we'll get to keep doing that for eternity. And I think it'll be a blast. And so like reproduction also, I think post-resurrection just isn't needed for humanity.
Death is no more.
Death, yeah. I mean, that to talk about, what your friend said about like, well, your life force is going to end. Well, that is true. And that's why TJ's hope is in the resurrection and also for him to be sowing into spiritual descendants and spiritual fruit that will be culminated in the coming kingdom, and we'll see the fruits of that in eternity and not in this immediate physical. And so then
I want to say,
go ahead.
But I do want to say, I think my relative was right when you told me that because I think that is a good, but it's just not the highest good. And that's why I think he should think more about what he's saying. I think you're right where you said the highest good is partaking in God's kingdom, and that spiritual continuity is a higher good than my life force continuing in the resurrection, and that spiritual continuity, that embodied spiritual continuity is more important than my life force continuing through my reproductive lineage. But that's also good. So again, that's kind of the tension that we've been pointing to.
It's good, but it's
like
just
a higher
not
good and lower good.
The highest good. And one of the check out, I think there might be more than one place in Isaiah. There's these promises to the eunuchs, and the eunuchs are, and I might have another recording about this, are specifically about, they're the people who can't have children, and because they can't have children, they don't get married, and they're cut off from this. And God says to these eunuchs who are faithful to me, who keep my Sabbaths, I will give them an everlasting name. That is bonkers in their imagination, because how do you get an everlasting name? You keep having children. You keep, son of Abraham, son of, that's how you get your name prolonged. But God's saying, oh, these eunuchs will have an everlasting name. And so that is the hope to those who say, I'm not going to worship either the God of pleasure or the God of self-fulfilling my name into the future, but I'm going to sacrifice, even, reject the idols, but potentially even just deny the illicit goods that God has created for this world in order to fully usher in that kingdom. Any final thoughts, TJ, on how we need to that tie in? Have I convinced you of sex mediocrity?
I think so. I hope we keep talking about these topics into the future of this podcast, because I think they're just important to keep delving into. And because a lot of the tensions or complexities in people's lives, I think, are around, they touch on these particular things that we've talked about in this episode. So yeah, I hope the conversation continues, basically. That's what I have to say.
Yeah, and we'd love your thoughts, whether you have a better name for what you think an alternative should be for Christians, if there's other biblical passages that give you more perspective on how Christians ought to think about sex. Send them our way. Let us know. And if you want, join our Patreon crew, where we have a little bit more opportunity to connect with you and with each other as a group. So I think that is all. Thanks for joining on this journey and for us thinking aloud together. Yeah, we hope that it is fruitful, and share this podcast with somebody if you think it might be helpful in their own thinking. Maybe even just share some of the scriptures and reflect on them with people, because I think our church needs a lot of help reflecting back upon, a better framing of God's view of sex. If that's not too bold to say. Okay.
Goodbye, everyone.
Ciao.